Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history. Specifically on this episode, the second part of a larger tale of how three brothers dealt with the death of their legendary father. This three-part series that I'm calling A Tale of Three Brothers is a story of sibling rivalry, betrayal, power, ambition, broken alliances, massive political restructuring, and each man's quest for legitimacy and legacy on a channel-spanning scale that includes kingdoms, duchies, and even the Holy Land itself. Now, as I stated in the first part, this episode was split into two parts due to it amounting to roughly an hour and a half long, so please make sure you're starting with the right episode. This, to be clear, is part 2. If you are, welcome back. Can't wait to tell you about what's on the episode today. And today, the rebellion begins, and it ends. How will England respond to its first crisis after the death of the man who brutally and ruthlessly conquered them just 20 years earlier? Will they rally around this man's son, the new king, or will they see it as an opportunity to stick it to the conqueror one last time by allowing one of his sons to fail? Now, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 a month. We have full series covering stories such as Poland's rise throughout the 11th century and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. Let's get started here. This is episode 148, entitled The Green Tree Prophecy, Part 2. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Within the first 3 months or so of 1088, without Rufus really catching wind of what was being prepared, Odo began amassing his forces at Pevensey Castle and Rochester Castle. It became abundantly clear what Odo's purpose was at Rufus's Christmas court. He wanted his lands and titles back, so he had a base of operations on the island. In fact, Barlow writes the following, quote, "The plan they hatched was to make Kent the main base, to appeal to old loyalties, to incite the garrisons of important castles, such as the Tower of London, to declare for Robert, to fortify ports in Kent and Sussex through which reinforcements from Normandy could be channeled, and to organize as many scattered diversions as possible." End quote. This came with a promise from his nephew, Robert Curthose, that plans were underway to send a Norman army to England to help Bishop Odo out. Once this powder keg blew, Odo would need the might of Normandy at his side in order to defeat and subdue any possible lingering holdouts against Robert's rule. As it goes, you can't continue to receive soldiers by the tens from surrounding towns and even from across the channel and someone not notify the king. And that's just what happened. But who could Rufus really turn to? He had a Norman rebellion on his southern coastline forming, but his entire nobility, the very men he surrounded himself with in England, were also Norman. Who could he truly trust? But something truly remarkable happened, and it was as if the green tree prophecy was in the minds of the people. Counting his allies, Rufus started taking a very critical and detailed look at his kingdom. Specifically, to begin, he looked at Sussex, which was the region along the western edge of Odo's Kent. For those non-UK listeners, it's good to know the geography of the rebellion of 1088. Sussex reached from the Channel coast to almost as north as London, and between Kent on its east and Shrewsbury on its west. Now, Sussex was going to be strategic for William Rufus because if he could keep Odo hemmed in, well, Kent was on England's southeasternmost corner. Short of also owning the waves of the North Sea and the Channel, coastlines that Kent also had full access to, this would keep Odo from being able to move further inland. Now, looking at Sussex, we see that this region was still very much like the rest of England, structured in the old, efficient Anglo-Saxon system of rapes. Yes, I understand a rape is a rather unfortunate name for it, but here we go anyway. So Sussex was split between 5 north-south strips called rapes. Each rape had a castle with a garrison, which was built, set up, and maintained under the Conqueror for the better part of 20 years now. By 1088, Sussex was pretty formidable. The westernmost rape was controlled from the castle at Arundel by the powerful Earl of Shrewsbury, Roger of Montgomery. The next rape to the east was controlled from the castle at Bramber, which was controlled by William de Bruce. In the middle of Sussex was the rape of Chichester, controlled also by Roger of Montgomery, because when Roger was given the earldom of Shrewsbury, the rapes of Arundel and Chichester were actually combined and came with the deal. Yeah. Isn't medieval English history fun, folks? Now, closer to Kent was the rape of Hastings, which was governed by Count Robert of Eu, who was actually back in Eu during this rebellion, so he was unlikely siding with either Rufus or Curthose in the whole affair. Probably a smart move. But to say Hastings wasn't a strategic castle in the whole thing would be naive. Hastings was the castle that William Rufus would employ to keep a close eye on the Channel for the Norman ships. And finally, right up against Odo's Kent, was the rape of Lewes, which, at the eruption of the rebellion, was controlled by William de Warenne. So, that was Rufus's Sussex. As for Odo's Kent, there were 4 major places I want to mention. Pevensey Castle was built near the site where, just 22 years earlier, Duke William of Normandy arrived to kick off this whole conquest thing. And this castle was currently being held by the Conqueror's other half-brother, Robert of Mortain. Along the coast is Dover, which is the closest major port between the mainland and England, and besides Pevensey is a very likely place for Robert Curthose to arrive with his army. Straight north from Dover is the famous Archbishopric of Canterbury. Keep in mind that Lanfranc was a close counselor of the very king that Odo was rebelling against. And finally, heading back west-northwest from Canterbury is Rochester Castle, or just the city of Rochester, Odo's primary home when visiting England. Rochester also happens to be the most formidable castle in Kent, and arguably up there with the most formidable in the entire English kingdom at the time. When Sussex and Kent were analyzed, Rufus made the historic choice to act swiftly. Gathering his magnates, he could see who showed up and who didn't, a clear indicator as to who was on which side of this impending conflict. Odo had the likes of the entirety of Normandy and Robert of Mortain, but a prominent Norman baron in Norfolk, Roger Bigod, also joined him. Remember, Roger Bigod was one of Rufus's named counselors as well, so Roger Bigod went the other way. And finally, Odo had the disgruntled Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, uncle of a man named Robert de Mowbray. Okay, this was okay. This was manageable for sure. As for the king, he welcomed a surprisingly large cadre of supporters to his court. The likes of Archbishop Lanfranc, of course, Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester, Archbishop Thomas of York, they all pledged the collective church for crown. And that wasn't actually nothing. As for the secular leadership, Rufus welcomed the likes of his good friend Robert Fitzhamon, son of a prominent sheriff back out in East Anglia. He welcomed Count Alan of Richmond, also named Rufus due to his exuberant bounty of fiery red hair, Earl Roger de Lacy of Hereford, Earl Hugh de Branch of Chester, and the aforementioned William of Bruges, who controlled the rape of Bramber in Sussex, as well as William of Warenne, who controlled the rape of Lewes. One of Rufus's first orders of business was to show the assembled how serious he was in rewarding those who supported him. Having control of the rape of Lewes, William de Warenne was instantly promoted to Earl. But Earl of what earldom? Kent was Odo's, Roger de Lacy had Hereford, Robert de Mowbray had Northumbria, Hugh of de Branch had Chester, Roger of de Montgomery had Shrewsbury. Hey, speaking of which, has anyone seen Robert de Mowbray of Northumbria? No? Huh. And what about Roger de Montgomery, for that matter? Well, and while we're at it, where was Rufus's closest advisor, Bishop of Durham, William of St. Calais? Well, Rufus would address that soon enough. So for right now, it was time to create a new earldom for his newest earl. William Rufus's first earldom he would create was Surrey. William de Warenne was now the first Earl of Surrey. This simple gesture lifted one man to the highest prominence while also, in essence, ensuring or buying the trust of the man closest to Odo's Kent. It's a pretty savvy move there, Rufus. Impressive. What's more was that even though he wasn't present at Rufus's court, the king elevated Robert de Mowbray to the Earl of Northumbria as a stiff resistance to any possible Scottish invasion. Things seemed fine between England and Scotland more or less at the time, but one thing needled Rufus. Word came that Robert Curthose was entertaining one Edgar Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside, back in Normandy. And Edgar Atheling never really gave up hope of taking back the crown of England for the line of his Edmund, Ethelred, Ethelstan, and Alfred. It was just enough of a rumor to put Rufus on guard when it came to his northern border. Now, while all this was happening at Rufus's court and in Odo's Kent, we find out that Robert de Mowbray, again the new Earl of Northumbria, was currently visiting his uncle, Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, over in Bristol. Also, we know that William of St. Calais, Bishop of Durham, was also somewhere in the south too. Just put a pin in all that for now. So, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that the conspiracy was planned out during Lent, which was after March 1st in 1088. But I'm sorry, that doesn't quite fly, as there was a clear boosting of garrisons over the previous couple months. That said, we learned from another document centering on a situation involving Bishop William of Durham, more on that later, that says that by March 12th, Dover, Hastings, and London had already had uprisings put down. Again, this was by March 12th, 1088. But it also gives the date of Easter, which was April 16th that year, as the date that the rebels chose to really make themselves known. It was then that William Rufus called together his army to march against Odo. But it wasn't actually all that simple. Uprisings popped up all around the island in April and May of 1088. They made everything complicated and hard to track, and honestly, the records are frustratingly convoluted, as you've already seen. It seemed no one really knew exactly what happened and when it happened, but there are some things we know for sure, things we can glean from the records, which is what I'll try my best to focus on here. Just know that the sheriffs played an undeniably huge role in the rebellion of 1088. And according to the records we do have, it's almost universal that the sheriffs overwhelmingly supported the new king. While the larger armies got all the airtime in the press, the sheriffs did all the dirty work, putting down smaller rebellions and civil unrest. The sheriffs who stand out in the records during this time are Ralph Pagnell of Yorkshire, Durand of Gloucestershire, and Ernest d'Aboteau of Worcestershire, all areas areas Frank Barlow refers to as England's quote-unquote most vulnerable areas, notified Rufus of their firm loyalty to him. A few others weren't sure at first, to be honest. Roger Bigott of Norfolk, again, we know, went to support Odo in Kent. But Hugh de Grandmesnil of Leicestershire and Geoffrey de Mandeville of London and Middlesex seemed to ride the fence for as long as possible. So why did Rufus enjoy such support? He was the son of the man who overthrew their own ancient line of kings. It's not exactly a great person to be, right? Well, in Rufus's first months, folks rather enjoyed having a kingdom all to themselves again. They didn't have to share their ruler with some French duchy. Besides, the Conqueror spent over 60%, as we learned on the last episode, of his reign as King of England, not in England. Now they had a king who had no other home but England. And as Barlow writes, quote, their interest lay in continuity, and by backing the winner and holding on to their offices, and sometimes transmitting them to their heirs, they began to create true English dynasties, end quote. Now, the island itself seemed to come alive in some sense by May 1088. We see this with the record of Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester. Keep in mind, Worcester was a good distance from Kent, so it just shows that certain areas, like, say, Cornwall and the Midlands, seemed a bit quiet. Not everywhere was that way. Well, Wulfstan kicked off his own thumbing of his nose at the rebels by preemptively excommunicating anyone who chose to join the rebellion against King William II. Rufus decided that Pevensey Castle and Rochester Castle were the two strongest fortified cities that Odo would most likely use, and it turns out that Rufus's ability to sniff things out was pretty keen. Pevensey would be his primary target to kick things off, as that was where Curthose would most likely send reinforcements, other than Dover, of course, but Dover was very deep into Kent territory. It was during Rufus's council that he decided to do something that his father never did. He appealed, not forced, the English to join him in battle. He pushed the idea that their kingdom was once again being invaded by a foreign invader, and this time, under his banner, they would triumph against the Normans. And you know what? It worked. Along with this sense of patriotic fervor, he decided to sweeten the pot with some tax breaks and an easing of anti-English laws that had been implemented under his father. This, of course, certainly couldn't hurt. Throw in some good, easing up on the forestry laws that were in place as well, and you're really talking to the people at this point. He also appealed to the kingdom's growing sense of identity, too. The people of Kent were currently suffering under Odo's ballooning army. As Orderic Vitalis puts it, quote, already rapacious freebooters began to pillage the peasants eagerly anticipating the arrival of Duke Robert, end quote. But as we know, it wasn't only in Kent. Vitalis goes on to say, quote, at the same time, Osborne, son of Richard, surnamed Scroop, with Bernard de Neufmarche, his son-in-law, and others in league with him, who held the frontiers of Mercia, made a savage inroad into the territory of Worcester, pillaging and slaughtering the inhabitants in spite of the prohibition and excommunication directed against them by the man of God, Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, end quote. It seems that Bishop Wulfstan's bold stand had caught up to him and his flock in Worcester. The people did indeed rally around their new king, but Vitalis takes some liberties here when their battle cry became something you would see in a Mel Gibson, William Wallace speech. Quote, act with firmness as the son of a king and yourself placed lawfully on the throne, command with confidence all your subjects. See you not our numbers who have already flocked to your standard and give you willing obedience? Send your orders through all England and crush the rebels with the weight of the lawful power. We will fight for you to death, and never shall another prince usurp your place in our affections. It would indeed be a folly and a crime to prefer a foreign enemy to a well-known king. The nation which breaks its allegiance to its prince must be held accursed. Death to the band which exults in the ruin of its lord. Search well the histories of English, and you will find them to have been always faithful to their kings." End quote. Again, could this be seen as the green tree earning the respect of the divine and beginning to reunite? Now, whether Orderic Vitalis was aware of this or not, I have no clue. Maybe he was. Remember, he was born to a Norman father and an Anglo-Saxon mother in England. So, did he realize that he kind of sort of just legitimized Harold Godwinson as the rightful king of England back in 1066? Well, think about it. When Vitalis said to search the history of the English, and you see that they have always been loyal to their king and have fought to the death for him, this explains why they fought so hard against William I and are now rallying for William II. William I was never elected by them. He just kind of took the crown as his own, whereas William II was elected by them. Norman nobility or not, after 20 years, you tend to consider your lord, well, yours. Just something to think about. In the waning days of April and earliest days of May, 1088, Rufus was preparing his army, and he needed men. And what he would do during this time would set a major precedent for future English kings, beginning with his successor. As the peasantry and lower nobility began forming the ranks, Rufus, probably at the urging of Lanfranc, publicly declared to his English subjects that should this rebellion be overcome, he promised to, quote, "restore to the people the best laws they had ever had, to abolish unjust taxes, and to give back to the people their forests and hunting rights." End quote. Now, to use Barlow's words, This set the precedent for a proto-charter of liberties to the English people. Now, whether he would follow through on these things or not is yet to be seen, but what it caused in the short term would reap huge rewards. What this did was pull Roger of Montgomery, the powerful earl, sitting the fence because his own son had sided with Odo in the rebellion. He couldn't help but be swayed to, at the very least, step out of the way and focus on the threats coming from the Welsh to the west. In late May, William Rufus marched a pretty stout army of English and Norman men. Orderic Vitalis tells us it was 30,000 soldiers, but we know about medieval exaggerations. Rufus was heading south to Pevensey Castle. It's more poetic that the very place Rufus was marching to in order to defeat the Norman invasion army was the very same port where his father had arrived 21 and a half years earlier with his own invasionary fleet. Now, when he arrived, Rufus encircled Pevensey Castle, cutting off supply lines and preventing any more reinforcements from the sea. The problem was that Pevensey Castle was one of the first fortified structures built on the island by the Conqueror, and had over the previous 2 decades been improved upon year by year. So, by 1088, Pevensey was quite formidable. To boot, Odo had seen a battlefield or two in his 50 or so years on this mortal coil, and he had been preparing for such a turn of events. Besides, Robert Curthose had promised supplies and reinforcements by the hundreds, so they just had to hold out a while. But as was well known already about Duke Robert, he was a terrible administrator. He may have been dashing, and he may have been charming and handsome and brave and all those things, but when it came to organizing and procuring funding and then spending it wisely, well, he was just not very good. The situation at Pevensey Castle quickly devolved into an unsustainable holdout against an organized and strong force ready to put down the rebellion as quickly as possible. Inside the castle itself, the defenders and their families began to starve. Orderic Vitalis writes the following, quote, "Starved of the assistance promised by Duke Robert and unable to hold out any longer, the defenders yielded the fortress. Weakened by famine and despair, they submitted to the king's forces." End quote. Initially, Pevensey surrendered after just a few weeks, which was a major win for the king, at least in the PR game being played. But again, Pevensey wasn't the biggest target on the chessboard. It seemed that Odo had chosen Rochester because of its central position between London and Canterbury. It was where the road leading between the two cities, Watling Street today, crosses the Medway River. It's worth noting that Pevensey may have been lost, but the Medway, a fairly major thoroughfare back then, had its mouth to the North Sea open up just south of the mighty Thames River mouth. The Thames went west-northwest, while the Medway ran west-southwest. The Medway allowed for easy access to Odo's Rochester, is the point. And if he could hold out there, then Robert Curthose could just take another day's trip toward the Medway, and the rebellion could continue. Now, by June, having received a couple hundred reinforcements from Curthose, they did arrive, Rochester seemed to house at least 500 knights. And Odo not only had control over the central citadel, but also the entire city, which was walled in full, including the church that would become one day the grand Rochester Cathedral. The thing is, see, by capturing Pevensey Castle, Rufus's army also captured both Robert of Mortain and Odo of Bayeux. Rufus had the rebellion dead to rights at this point. He negotiated from the highest leverage point, and Odo was forced to do as the king said. They would ride together to Rochester, where Odo would call for the surrender of the garrison there, thus ending the rebellion entirely. Having neutralized for the time being Pevensey, and knowing his back was now secured, Rufus pushed his way north-northeast toward Rochester, his two rebellious uncles in tow. Dover was still unstable due to the influence of William of U's forces, which were undermining Odo's influence there, and Hastings had a similar story, so Rufus was feeling okay pushing deeper into Kent. While he was moving toward Rochester, Rufus was able to lavish his victorious leaders with gifts and titles, thus further ensuring he'd bought their undying loyalty. However, there was one major development that began during the siege of Pevensey and had moved to a nearby Cluniac monastery. His brand new earl, William de Warenne, 1st Earl of Surrey, had been wounded with a nasty arrow to the leg. He was sent to a church he himself had founded some years earlier where he would recuperate. So for the moment, Rufus was without one loyal earl, which was a bit of a blow to the effort. William de Warenne was certainly a powerful presence. Not to be deterred, though, Rufus continued to move north. While Rufus was moving north, he was sending smaller parts of his army out in all directions, ensuring the surrounding Kentish towns and villages were on board with opposing the rebellion. There was also another little kerfuffle in London, centering around the Tower of London again, which was newly completed in recent years, led by the Sheriff Geoffrey de Mandeville, mentioned earlier. Remember, he was one of the sheriffs who sided with the rebellion. Rufus decided something that would ripple a bit for the next month or so. Rufus decided to split his army. He would head to London to help put down Mandeville's uprising there, while he entrusted his uncle Odo to ride to Rochester and negotiate the surrender there. Yeah, you definitely heard that right. He sent Odo to negotiate his own surrender. Oh, don't worry. Odo was being escorted by a group of men to help with negotiations. But those men, well, they were unarmed for some reason. So yeah, what happened was this, in Barlow's words, quote, "When William sent Odo ahead with a small and unarmed escort to negotiate the surrender, the garrison burst out," this is the garrison at Rochester, "the garrison burst out, captured the whole party, and continued the war. There was no certainty at the time whether Odo connived or condoned, but William was tricked." End quote. Again, I wish I could go into more detail, but the records are scarce and the records we have often don't jive with one another. Now, this was a blow to Rufus for sure, but he would not be dissuaded. He cleaned up London and decided to head to Rochester right away, but he had to ensure that his back was still safe. Having taken Pevensey already, he felt okay, but there was one town he had to ensure was under control before riding against Rochester in full. Now, just 20 miles south of Rochester was a town called Tonbridge. It wasn't really known for anything up to this point, but it did have a motte and bailey erected from the Conqueror's first months on the island. Since then, the motte and bailey had begun to shift into a stone structure, but it was nowhere near what castles like those at Pevensey and Rochester and Dover had become. A man named Gilbert Fitzrichard, or Gilbert de Clare, was in charge there, and he saw it as his solemn duty to protect the road between Odo's Rochester and Robert of Mortaine's Pevensey. And when Pevensey fell, he saw it as his solemn duty to be the bulwark against Rufus's approaching army. Tonbridge was quickly made ready for war. This is mid-June, and as Rufus approached Tonbridge, word came from the marches out west that the Welsh had once again started to blow things up along Offa's Dyke, specifically, though, in the south. My presumption here, but I wonder if it's because the Welsh saw a weakened England and thought they could capitalize. Seems plausible to me, and I don't blame them. This also had a curiously beneficial effect for Rufus, too. See, by the Welsh rising up, this pulled Roger of Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, who was sitting the fence, what pulled him out west. We know that Earl Roger had more or less sided with Rufus by officially not siding with anyone, but by Roger handling the Welsh, Rufus was assured that he couldn't possibly help the rebellion. Another development shows up in the records, seemingly out of nowhere at this point, too. The records mention something about Robert Curthos's reinforcements being, quote-unquote, intercepted by the king's pirates. It turns out that this was a very basic naval struggle going on between England's ships and Normandy's ships. Well, okay, that makes it sound like the two places had their own navies. No, it was more like the King of England and the Duke of Normandy were funding some local pirates to play some pirating games out in the Channel. Well, this resulted in a few times when Curthos's reinforcements were turned around or even sunk. Rufus knew that Tonbridge had to be taken care of as soon as possible because he couldn't count on his pirates in the Channel to be successful all the time. He also knew that Rochester was now jam-packed with all the major players in the rebellion. Kent was shrinking fast, so Rochester was their last stand as they prayed for reinforcements to finally bust through to the mouth of the Medway. Odo, Eustace III of Boulogne, the Montgomery brothers, remember their dad was neutral and preoccupied in Wales at the time, they were all, with their collective forces, cooped up inside the walls of Rochester. This would not be easy for Rufus. Again, though, Tonbridge was first. Rufus assembled his entire army and laid siege to Tonbridge. They dug in, they encircled, they were there until the bitter end. And Tonbridge's rebellious commander, the proud Gilbert de Clare, dug in as well. And 2 days later, the siege overcame the town and Gilbert de Clare surrendered. 2 days. The route between Pevensey and Rochester was now secured, pretty fully, but nothing was set in stone. There were too many variables. Should Odo gain another foothold, he could turn the subdued Kent against the king again. If Rufus didn't act, the rebels could escape Rochester. And if Roger of Montgomery dealt with the Welsh in a timely manner, he could stand up and protect his rebellious sons and march against Rufus, who knew what was going to happen. Thoroughly isolated, Rochester stood alone, the beating heart of the rebellion of 1088. Rufus's strategy was simple but effective. He encircled the walled city, cutting off supplies instantly. This went on for roughly 4 weeks, so far as I can tell. Within the first week or two, word came from Lewis, the monastery where William de Warenne was recuperating from the arrow wounds suffered at Pevensey, that Rufus's first Earl of Surrey had succumbed to his injury and died. The date was June 24th. Barlow writes, quote, William was a relentless if chivalrous commander, end quote, and he knew that the time was running out. The whole thing just took a new and far more dangerous turn. King William II, within 9 months of first donning the crown, had created a brand new earldom and lost its first earl during a rebellion to his reign. Rufus called up more men from around the kingdom. He let Uncle Odo slip away after Pevensey, and he determined that would never happen again. But these particular men he called for to join him at Rochester weren't necessarily for soldiering. He had a good-sized army as it was. What he needed were laborers. He used these men to build 2 castles of his own within sight of the walls of Rochester, and he devoted his soldiers to bolster the blockade. He would squeeze Rochester until it passed out or passed away. there was no settling for anything less, not at this point in the game. And it took a matter of days for the effects of the siege to begin to affect the city. And during this time, after a couple of weeks, Roger at Montgomery, having subdued the Welsh for the moment, rode into Rufus's camp. Someone seemed a bit worried for his sons, who were currently suffering along with the people of Rochester. But suffering to what degree exactly? Here's what Orderic Vitalis had to say about the matter. Quote, "A plague, like the plague of the Egyptians, made its appearance in the town of Rochester. The Almighty, who in all ages superintends human affairs and orders them aright, have chosen to renew an ancient miracle in modern times. For as the flies tormented the Egyptians and did not cease a moment from whizzing round them, in the same manner these flies grievously annoyed the besieged with their incessant attacks. For all the egress from the castle was prevented, and many of those who were thus blockaded fell sick from their various sufferings, and their disorders increasing at length died. Innumerable flies were engendered in the dung of men and horses, and being nourished by the heat of both the summer and of the atmosphere caused by the breath of so many inhabitants closely pent up, their swarms horribly infested their eyes and noses, food and drink. So severely was the insolent band of rebels afflicted with the annoyance of these swarms that they could not eat their meals either by day or night, unless a great number of them were employed in turn and flapping them away from the counselors' faces." End quote. The flies were so thick, both day and night, that they had to take turns eating while a few people around them swatted the flies away from your food and face. William of Malmesbury wrote of a possible outbreak of dysentery when he mentions, quote-unquote, "a grievous disease wasted their bodies." He also talks of, quote-unquote, "the double horror of famine and disease that wasted the bodies of the garrison." It seemed that Robert Curthose, his attempts to send help, he tried, but the channel was a bit moody, and storms sunk ships and reversed them, and Rufus's naval blockade, if you want to call it navy, was still running on all cylinders. From the vantage point of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which was probably written at this time at nearby Canterbury, deep within Odo's Kent, it says, quote, "The king's forces surrounded Rochester with a fierce resolve. Hunger and sickness overtook the rebels, who yielded the stronghold to him, begging for mercy." End quote. After only about 4 weeks, unable to withstand conditions in the city any longer, envoys of Odo were sent out to Rufus's camp to negotiate a surrender. They wanted all the lands and titles to be given back and reconfirmed by the king, as well as their lives as they journeyed home. Rufus flatly refused. But then Roger of Montgomery stepped in and boldly spoke to the king to see reason. Barlow writes, quote, "Orderic describes a great debate in which William and the barons contended with biblical texts." End quote. Now, I'll spare you the details, but there's mention of King David and Banah and Rechab, quote, "Rimmon and Berothite, who beheaded Ishbosheth in his own house," end quote. I mean, it's all there. It was a whole thing in Orderic's account, but in the end, in Orderic's own words, quote, "The noble-minded king, vanquished by the prayers of his faithful followers, granted their request, and relieving the besieged from the sentence of death or mutilation, granted them leave to depart from the place with their horses and men. But he utterly refused them all expectation of having any inheritance or lands within the realm of England as long as he was on the throne." End quote. What's more is that Uncle Odo asked King William to, not play the trumpets as the defeated army marched out of the castle in front of everyone. And the young king flatly refused this request too. He'd given his uncle a chance to surrender, trusted him to go back and order Rochester to stand down, and he was betrayed. Orderic writes that Rufus, quote-unquote, "would not grant it for 1,000 marks of gold." But as ruthless as Rufus was being toward his uncle and the man's shattered and disease-riddled forces, embarrassing them as they marched out of the city in utter shame, Rufus learned something about a king's subjects in that moment. They were pissed he was letting them off the hook so easily. But the humiliation of Odo and the rebels subdued them enough not to turn back on Rufus. Orderic puts a lid on the rebellion of 1088 like this, quote, "Thus the unholy bishop was banished from England, and his vast domains were forfeited, so that the prodigious wealth which he had iniquitously amassed was, by the last judgment of God, lost with signal disgrace. He retired in confusion to Bayeux, and never again set foot in England." End quote. Yep, the likes of Bishop Odo of Bayeux, Robert of Mortain, Robert of Belem, and his two little brothers, all three sons of Roger Montgomery, remember? Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria, Geoffrey de Mowbray, the Bishop of Coutances, Norfolk Sheriff Roger Bigod, and several others were all forever kicked out of England, never to return. King William II Rufus overcame a major obstacle in his bid to secure his crown, and it was a resounding victory, not only across England, but also Normandy, as his brother the Duke was also embarrassed and lost quite a bit of face in the ordeal. He just simply was not able to deliver. Now, as for the earldom of Kent, it ceased to exist after July of 1088, forevermore. William Rufus absorbed the earldom into unclaimed royal lands, entrusting specific cities to loyal noblemen who ruled in his stead. Places like Dover and Rochester, Hastings and Pevensey, even Little Tonbridge. These were all, technically, Rufus's direct landholdings, while Canterbury remained quite autonomous by the standards of the day, entrusting the city to the archbishop there. As for his nobility, they doubled down on their loyalty to the king, including Roger Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, who had just watched his sons exiled back to Normandy. But one person missing from the festivities was Bishop William of Durham, also known as William of St. Calais, former protege of Bishop Odo. Where in the world could that pesky bishop have gone to at this point in the proceedings?
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
At the top of the show, we heard a quote from the Vita Edwardi Regis, a commissioned biography of King Edward II, the Confessor. The Vita Edwardi, commissioned by Queen Edith, wife of Edward, daughter of Earl Godwin, if you remember, and sister to the mighty future King Harold Godwinson. Well, it began as a love letter to the future about how amazing her father and brothers were. Not Edward. But after Edward's death in 1066 and the subsequent events of the next few years, the Vita took on a new life as a way for some anonymous monk working on commission to pour into it some fun prophecies about the state of England, as well as a way to cement Harold Godwinson's legitimization as true King of England in 1066. The Vita itself was finished years after Edward's death, so it was without question influenced by the conquest that was gripping the kingdom at the time. And I think its author pinpointed the predicament the lowly Anglo-Saxon population was in. This story of the green tree was itself an apocalyptic story, a metaphor of the end of Anglo-Saxon England. Remember, this story was said to have taken place on Edward's deathbed, so that would make it in late December 1065 or the first few days of January 1066. As I said earlier, there was absolutely no way to tell what 1066 was about to bring, at least not in terms of when Edward was dying. This is why the story of the Green Tree prophecy is so interesting. Let's suppose it did actually happen in this way. Let's suppose he did burst out of a deep sleep and said this dream. What was the dream all about? What's the story really about? Well, the plight of Edward to the monks in his dream when he asked if England could repent at this point and turn away from their evil ways that have led them to such a demise. This is outright paralleled to the story of Nineveh, a city in the book of Jonah that avoided destruction through repentance. Nineveh was included in this prophecy because it was a sign of hope. However, the monks deny the possibility for English repentance being a saving measure for the kingdom. What would occur after Edward's death would be irreversible. Now, the green tree itself is pretty interesting too. Let's split this into two parts. Do you see what I did there? Let's split the, okay, never mind. The color green and the tree itself. First, green symbolizes life and vitality, even in the face of catastrophe. The tree in the prophecy symbolizes England itself, a united, strong, ancient structure. So the prophecy goes, the green tree is struck and split, and then separated a great distance from its other half. The monks in Edward's dream state that the tree will never, by human efforts alone, be united again. This green tree is also linked with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 31, when it says, quote, "For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it's dry?" End quote. I thought about this for a long time, and I wonder if it relates to England being in a state of grace and prosperity at the time of Edward's death, especially in comparison to what it was to come later that year and beyond. To me, we can read this prophecy through the lens of the Gospel of Luke as if it's saying that even a kingdom at its strongest can succumb to weakness and overthrow. Imagine what things would be like if England had been weak when the Normans arrived near Pevensey, when the tree was dry, you could say. The profundity of this deathbed prophecy strikes me as a glimpse into the medieval mind's ability to see much deeper into things than we even get close to giving it credit for. But the tree hasn't just been irrevocably split and separated. No, each of these two parts still holds the sap created by its unity, and from this life-giving sap, it will once again bear fruit, leaf, even separate. It would do these things. Remember, it will take divine intervention for the two halves to come together, but each half must do its part to show its strength and resolve in separation by bearing fruit and leafing fully throughout the year. Only then will God reward it with its unity. We kind of seeing the parallels? Do you remember when I mentioned that being called English during and immediately after the conquest was a badge of dishonor? Well, it would take a solid 2 generations, at least, for things to begin to shift, to see the united English identity begin to coalesce. So when we consider what happens next in our story of the fallout of William the Conqueror's death, remember the plight of the English tenant farmers, the merchants, the conscripted soldiers. But also one must wonder whether the English loyalty to their king, at this point King William II Rufus, their loyalty to the king during the rebellion of 1088 was a sign of one of those separated branches of the green tree putting in the work of flowering, of trying to make success and survival a reality. Were the oppressed, colonized, and ravaged English the first to make the effort necessary for God to rejoin the separated tree, to repair the broken kingdom? And was the rebellion of 1088 the first opportunity to do so? One might look upon this event as just that, the first moment when the English overwhelmingly swallowed their distrust and hatred for Norman leadership and sought a new way forward. Of all the things that occurred under William II Rufus's rule, I believe the rebellion of 1088 was the most important, and this, in my humble opinion, is one of the most underrated moments in English history. A moment when England united and fought against a common enemy, and succeeded. An identity began to be forged under Rufus, and that's not nothing. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.